Evelyn Harper did not cry when Barrett Holloway slapped her contract down on the poker table and told the room she was the only thing left he owned worth betting. She did not scream. She did not beg. She sat perfectly still in that smoke-filled saloon, her hands folded in her lap, and she made herself a promise so quiet that nobody in that rowdy room could have heard it above the laughter. I will not let this be the end of my story. If this woman's fight for dignity moves you, subscribe to our channel and follow every part of her journey to the very last word. Drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The Iron Horse Saloon had seen plenty of ugly things in its years, standing at the edge of Silver Creek, Montana. It had seen men shot over accusations of cheating. It had seen fortunes dissolve across green felt tables between one heartbeat and the next. It had seen boys walk in thinking themselves men and walk out with nothing but the lesson. But on the night of October the 14th, 1884, the saloon witnessed something that would be talked about across the territory for decades, not because of the violence and not because of the money, but because of the woman sitting alone in the corner who never once looked away from the wall. Her name was Evelyn Harper, 27 years old. Brown hair that had never known the luxury of ribbons. Hands roughened from years of labor that had earned her nothing but more labor. A body that the women of Silver Creek described with cruelty and the men of Silver Creek dismissed entirely full, soft. The kind of figure that this particular era of this particular territory had decided was something to be pitied or mocked, depending on who was doing the looking. She wore a plain dress the color of old wheat, mended in 3 places she hoped nobody would notice. She noticed. She always noticed. She was sitting in the corner of the Iron Horse because she had nowhere else to go. That was the truth of it, simple and devastating. Barrett Holloway had brought her there. Barrett Holloway, who smelled of whiskey and bad decisions, who had the kind of handsome face that made women trust him exactly long enough for him to take something from them. He had found Evelyn 6 months earlier when she was working at the laundry on the edge of town. Grubbing other people's clothes for coins she immediately spent on food and a bed in a rooming house, where the landlady reminded her every single morning that her presence was a temporary inconvenience. Barrett had offered her steady work, cooking for him, managing the house he rented, keeping his affairs in order. He had spoken to her like she mattered, and Evelyn, who had spent most of her life being addressed as though she were furniture, had made the catastrophic mistake of believing him. 6 months of cooking his meals and cleaning his rooms and listening to him promised that things were about to turn around. 6 months of watching him come home later and later, losing more and more at the card tables downtown. 6 months of being told to stay quiet when his business associates came to visit, to make herself scarce, to remember her place. She thought she had understood her place. She had been wrong about what place he had in mind. Last card, gentlemen. Barrett's voice cut through the noise of the saloon like a blade. Last card, and I need something on the table worth playing for. Evelyn heard him from her corner. She did not turn around. She had learned, with Barrett, that the best strategy was usually to become as invisible as possible and wait for whatever storm was moving through him to pass. She stared at the rough wooden wall in front of her and listened to the fire crackling in the hearth nearby. And she told herself this would pass the way everything passed. I got nothing left worth betting, Barrett continued. His voice had taken on that particular edge. She recognized the one that preceded poor choices. But I got something better than money. Better than money? That was Holt Granger's voice, one of the regulars, a man who laughed too loudly at things that weren't funny. What's better than money, Holloway? Usefulness, Barrett said. I got someone who cooks, cleans men's gardens, someone who cost me money to keep fed and housed, and who I won't be needing anymore one way or another. Might as well get something for her. The room went quiet in the specific way. Rooms go quiet when something is happening that everyone present understands they should object to, but intends to witness regardless. Evelyn turned around. Barrett was reaching into his coat pocket. He pulled out a piece of paper, an actual piece of paper, folded in quarters, which he smoothed out flat on the poker table with the same casual motion a man might use to reveal a winning card. He picked up his glass, took a long drink, and gestured toward the corner where Evelyn sat without looking at her directly. Her, he said's bet is her. Nobody laughed. Not immediately. Then someone did, and the sound was like a match dropped on dry grass, spreading fast and ugly across the room. "You're betting a woman," Holt Granger said, and there was something in his voice that might have been disbelief, but was actually closer to amusement, the kind that comes from watching something you know is wrong and deciding it's entertainment instead. "I'm betting a contract," Barrett corrected, as though the distinction mattered. "A work arrangement. She's been under my roof for 6 months. She works for me. I'm transferring that arrangement. Winner gets a cook and a housekeeper. It ain't complicated." "It ain't exactly proper neither," said another voice older, rougher, but the objection died without anyone picking it up and carrying it anywhere meaningful. Evelyn stood up. Her legs felt strange, like the floor had tilted slightly beneath her without anyone else noticing. The firelight made everything in the room amber and wavering. She could see the table clearly from where she stood, 5 men seated around it, cards in hand, money piled in the center, and in the middle of all of it, Barrett's folded piece of paper sitting there, like the most ordinary thing in the world. "Barrett," her voice came out steadier than she felt. "What are you doing?" He looked at her then, just briefly. "Sit down, Evelyn. What is that paper?" I said, "Sit down." "I heard what you said." She took a step forward. "I asked you a question." Something flickered across his face, irritation, mostly, and beneath it, something that might have been shame if shame were something Barrett Holloway was capable of sustaining for longer than a second and a half. "It's business," he said. "You wouldn't understand it. Sit down and let the men finish their game." "I understand enough," Evelyn said. "I understand that paper has my name on it." Laughter rippled around the table again. One of the men, she didn't know his name, a younger man with a red kerchief around his neck, leaned back in his chair and looked her over with the particular expression men used when they were deciding whether something was worth their time. His face settled into dismissal. She had seen that expression so many times she could have drawn it from memory. "She talks back," he said to nobody in particular. "How much is the bet, Holloway?" "Might be more trouble than she's worth." "She's manageable," Barrett said with the certainty of a man who had decided that described her accurately. He said it the way someone might describe a difficult horse, something to be broken and worked with rather than listened to. Evelyn looked at the man who had given her a roof and called it generosity for 6 months. She looked at the paper on the table with her name on it. She looked at the roomful of men who were treating this moment as entertainment. And then she looked across the table at the one man who had not yet spoken. He was sitting at the far end, away from the firelight, which was probably why she hadn't noticed him immediately. Broad-shouldered, somewhere in his middle 30s, with the particular stillness of someone who had learned to take up less space than his physical presence actually required. He wore working clothes, not a gambling man's clothes, not dressed to impress, and his hat sat on the table beside his cards rather than on his head. Dark hair, a jaw that needed a shave, eyes that were watching the paper on the table with an expression she couldn't immediately read. He was the only one who had not laughed. He was the only one who had not said anything at all. She watched him pick up his cards. She watched his expression give away nothing. And then she forced herself to look away, because it didn't matter, none of these men mattered. This room didn't matter. What mattered was that she was standing in a saloon in Silver Creek, Montana, while a man she had worked herself to exhaustion for was betting her across a card table, like she was a pocket watch he'd grown tired of carrying. "Barrett," she said again, and she meant for her voice to be steady, but something raw crept into it anyway, something she hated for being there, because the last thing she was willing to give this room was proof that they could hurt her. "You cannot do this. Already done it," he said pleasantly. "Sit down, Evelyn." She did not sit down. She stood exactly where she was and watched the final hand of that poker game play out with the particular horror of someone watching something happen in a dream, the kind where you know it's wrong, but your feet have forgotten how to move. The hands went around, Chips moved, men shifted in their seats, some leaning forward, some leaning back with forced casualness. Barrett's confidence shifted visibly as the hand progressed. She watched it happen, watched the small muscle in his jaw start to work the way it did when he was calculating, and didn't like the numbers. He was drawing to something he needed and not getting it. She could read him that clearly even now, even across a room, even while everything inside her was screaming in a register too high for anyone around her to hear. The man at the far end of the table said nothing through any of it. He simply played. Barrett laid down his cards with the specific desperation of a man who has convinced himself almost hard enough that he is about to win. Three of a kind. He smiled with one side of his mouth and reached toward the center of the table. Not so fast. The quiet man at the far end laid his cards down flat without ceremony or drama. 4 cards of the same suit in sequence. He didn't smile. He didn't crow or pound the table or do any of the things the other men at that table had been doing all evening every time luck broke their way. He simply placed his cards on the table and looked at them for a moment, and then looked up. Not at Barrett. The room erupted. Men shoved back from the table. Coins scraped across wood. Voices overlapped into noise. Barrett made a sound that wasn't quite a word and wasn't quite an animal sound, but lived somewhere in between. He shoved back his chair. He grabbed the whiskey glass in front of him and set it down again without drinking, which was the clearest sign she had ever seen that he was furious. Because Barrett Holloway, in any state of distress, reached for the nearest glass as automatically as breathing. "Well," Holt Granger's voice cut through the commotion, thick with amusement. "Looks like you won yourself a housekeeper, Callahan." The quiet man Callahan did not respond to this. He was looking at Barrett's piece of paper in the center of the table. Looking at it the way you'd look at something that had ended up in front of you without your having intended it, which was, Evelyn thought distantly, an extremely reasonable expression given the circumstances. "That woman comes with the pot," one of the other men said, clearly enjoying himself. "Them's the terms." Callahan picked up the paper. He looked at it. Then he looked across the table at Evelyn, who had not moved, who was still standing in the same spot with her hands folded in front of her and her face arranged into the expression she had perfected over years of situation she could not control, not blank, not defeated, but absolutely still. A woman made of stillness. That was what this room was seeing. What it did not see, what she did not allow it to see, was the furious, terrified, incandescent thing living just beneath that stillness that was deciding, even now, in this moment, that she would not break. Callahan stood up. He was taller than he'd seemed sitting down. He put on his hat. He picked up his money from the table and pocketed it. Then he picked up Barrett's paper again, looked at it one more time, and did something that made the room fall completely, utterly silent. He tore it in half. "Nobody belongs to anyone," he said. His voice was quiet. It was the kind of quiet that doesn't need volume because it already has weight, the kind that makes a room lean in rather than straining to hear. He set both halves of the paper on the table. He looked at Barrett Holloway with an expression that Evelyn could only describe, later, when she was trying to make sense of this evening, as contempt so controlled it was almost polite. Then he picked up his hat, walked around the table, and stopped about 6 feet from where Evelyn stood. The room was completely silent now. Every man in that saloon was watching this moment with the suspended attention of people who don't know what's about to happen and are suddenly genuinely uncertain. "Ma'am," Callahan said. He was not looking at her with pity. He was not looking at her with the calculating expression of a man reassessing a bet. He was looking at her the way you look at another person, direct, present, without the additional weight of judgment that she had gotten so accustomed to carrying from every pair of eyes that ever found her across a room that she'd stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing the sound of wind. You don't have to go anywhere you don't want to go. That's your choice to make. Evelyn stared at him. She had prepared herself during the course of this last hand for several possible futures. She had prepared herself for winning, which seemed unlikely, and for losing in the most specific kind of way, which was this way, ending up the property of a stranger who had more claim to her in the eyes of a poker table than she had to herself. She had prepared herself for humiliation and for the particular exhaustion of having to figure out what came next from a position of having absolutely nothing. She had not prepared herself for this. "My name is Wyatt Callahan," the man said. "I run a ranch about 4 miles east of here. I've got extra space in the bunkhouse, a separate room that locks from the inside. If you need somewhere to be while you figure out what comes next, the offer's there. No conditions attached to it. You just tore up that paper," she said. "I did." "That," she stopped, started again. "Barrett would say that paper gave you a claim." "Barrett would be wrong," Callahan said simply. "Wasn't my paper to begin with, wasn't his either. You can't write a person's name on a piece of paper and call that ownership. Don't matter what anyone in this room thinks about that." Barrett made a sound of outrage from across the room. "Now hold on a minute, Callahan. That paper was legal." "No, it wasn't." Callahan didn't raise his voice. He didn't look away from Evelyn. He spoke to Barrett the way you'd speak to an interruption from behind a wall, acknowledging it, just enough to dismiss it. "Wasn't legal, wasn't decent, and it's in 2 pieces now, so I reckon the conversation's done." The room shifted. Evelyn could feel it, the particular shift of a crowd that has been expecting one thing and gotten another. Some of the men were uncomfortable. Some were amused in a different way now, not at her but at the situation, at the novelty of it. A few were watching Callahan with the wary respect of people reassessing someone they'd underestimated. Holt Granger made a low sound. "Well, ain't that something?" "She still needs somewhere to go," said the older man, with the rough voice, who had made the brief objection earlier. There was no cruelty in his tone this time, something that might have been honesty even. "Holloway here ain't gonna take her back after this. Where's she supposed to end up?" "That's her business to decide," Callahan said. "Not yours, not mine." He looked at Evelyn again. "What do you want to do, ma'am?" What did she want to do? The question landed on her like something she had not heard in so long she'd forgotten the sound of it. What did she want? Not what was expected of her, not what was practical, not what someone else had decided was appropriate. What did she want? She looked at Barrett Holloway, who was still standing there, with fury running hot across his face and something else underneath it, something that looked almost like relief. Which was probably the most honest thing she had ever seen from him in 6 months. She looked at the men around the room, at their various expressions: entertainment, discomfort, curiosity. The specific blankness of men who have already decided this situation doesn't concern them and are waiting for it to resolve so they can get back to their cards. She looked at the 2 halves of the paper on the table. Then she looked at Wyatt Callahan. 4 miles east, she said. "Yes, ma'am, and the room locks from the inside." "Bought that lock myself," he said, "from Jensen's Hardware 2 months ago. There's a key on the inside and a bolt. Nobody goes in without your say-so." She picked up the small bag she'd had at her feet, everything she owned, which didn't take up much space. Which had never taken up much space, and she walked toward the door of the Iron Horse Saloon without looking back at Barrett Holloway even once. She heard him say something behind her. She didn't catch all the words, only the bitterness in them, the specific bitterness of a man who expected the world to be arranged to his convenience and was perpetually aggrieved to discover otherwise. She heard one of the other men laugh. She heard Callahan's boots on the wooden floor behind her, not rushing, just following at a distance that kept space between them. The night air outside the saloon was cold and clean and smelled of wood smoke and distant pine. Evelyn stood on the boardwalk and took a long breath and tried to understand what had just happened. A man she'd never met had torn up a piece of paper with her name on it and asked her what she wanted. She couldn't quite make it make sense. Callahan's wagon was tied at the post near the saloon's sidewall, a practical wagon, well maintained, with 2 solid horses that turned their heads to regard her with the calm, judgmental intelligence of animals who had been around long enough to have opinions. He came out behind her and untied the horses and went to the back of the wagon and took out a folded wool blanket which he held out to her without speaking. "It's cold," he said, when she hadn't taken it immediately. "I know it's cold," she said. She took the blanket. "I've been cold before. I don't doubt it," he said. He helped her up onto the wagon seat with a steadiness that asked nothing from her, no gratitude, no acknowledgement, just the practical assistance of a hand extended to someone who needed height to reach a wagon seat. Then he went around to the other side and climbed up himself and took the reins. They pulled out of Silver Creek in silence. The town was quiet at this hour, the main street dark except for the lights of the saloon and the glow from Jensen's Hardware, where someone had left a lamp burning. They passed the church and the general store and the small schoolhouse, with its bell tower standing dark against the stars. And then the buildings fell away, and there was nothing on either side but the wide flat dark of the Montana Territory, stretching out in every direction, with the mountains making their vast shapes against the sky. Evelyn sat on the wagon seat with the wool blanket over her shoulders and stared straight ahead and stopped the shaking that had started in her hand sometime during the last half hour and hadn't stopped yet. She was not cold. The shaking was not from cold. She pressed her hands flat against her thighs and breathed carefully, and told herself there would be time to fall apart later. There was always later. There was always some private moment she could locate, eventually, to put herself back together in. This was not that moment. This moment required her to be alert and clear-eyed, and to pay attention to the man sitting 3 feet from her who had torn up a piece of paper with her name on it, and might have his own reasons for doing so that she didn't yet understand. "Why did you do that?" she asked. Callahan didn't answer immediately. He kept his eyes on the road being mostly a track through grass that had been traveled enough times to indicate a direction. "Do what specifically?" he said. "Tear up that paper." He was quiet for a moment. Because it was the right thing to do. "That's not a complete answer." He glanced at her sideways. Something in his expression shifted, not quite amusement, but something adjacent to it, something that suggested he was not entirely surprised to find himself being pressed for a better answer. "No," he agreed. Another silence. The horses moved steadily. An owl called somewhere off to the left. "I've sat in that saloon a fair number of times," Callahan said finally. "I've seen money change hands, I've seen land bet and lost. I've seen men do things across that table that I thought were the worst I was likely to see." He paused. "I was wrong about that, apparently. You didn't have to get involved." "No," he said, "I didn't. Most men wouldn't have." "I know it. So why did you?" He thought about it for long enough that she started to think he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "My mother raised me with the understanding that there's a difference between things that are legal and things that are right." She was a very specific woman about that distinction. I've found she was correct. Evelyn looked at him. The side of his face in the darkness, the set of his jaw, the way he held the reins not tight, not loose, just present. A man paying attention to what he was doing. "She sounds like she was a remarkable woman," Evelyn said. "She was," Callahan said. "She died 12 years ago. I still hear her voice. When I'm about to do something she'd have thoughts about." "What is she saying right now?" Something shifted in his expression again. This time it was closer to a real smile, brief and a little reluctant, like something he hadn't intended to let out. "Probably that I should have said something about 10 minutes sooner," he said. Evelyn turned back to face the road ahead of them. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "For what it's worth," she said, "I didn't need saving." "I know that," he said immediately. "You were handling it." "I was about to walk out. I could see that. I want to be clear about it." "You're clear," he said. "I hear you." She believed him, which was strange. She hadn't believed a man about anything in a considerable amount of time. The believing felt unfamiliar, like a muscle she'd stopped using that was making itself known again. They rode in silence for a while. The stars above the Montana Territory were extravagant, more stars than most places bothered with, stretched across the sky in a density that seemed almost excessive, as though the universe had decided this particular part of the world deserved a particularly detailed ceiling. Evelyn had noticed that before, on nights when she wasn't exhausted to the point where noticing things felt like too much effort. Tonight, with the cold and the wool blanket and the strange dreamlike quality of everything that had just happened, she noticed again. "How long have you had the ranch?" she asked. "Going on 8 years, Callahan said. "By yourself. I've got 2 ranch hands, older fella named Silas and a younger one named Cody. Good men, both of them. They won't bother you." I wasn't worried about being bothered, she said, which was not entirely true, but was the thing she wanted to be true. "I know," he said, in a tone that suggested he understood the difference. "The room locks," he said again. "I want you to know that's not something I'm going to walk back in the morning." She looked at him again. "You don't know anything about me," she said. "That's true," he agreed. "I could be." She tried to think of something alarming. "I could be difficult. Most worthwhile people are," Callahan said. She didn't know what to say to that. She had spent 6 months being told, in various ways and registers, that she was not worthwhile at all, that her presence was a burden, her size an inconvenience, her opinions an imposition, her existence a problem to be managed. She had started to believe it the way you start to believe anything that's repeated to you, often enough, and with conviction. Not completely. There was something in her that had resisted, something stubbornly certain that the version of herself that Barrett described was not the real one. But it had been wearing thin. This man, this stranger, this rancher who smelled of horses and hay and woods had just the words "most worthwhile people are" and meant them to land on her like a small grace. And they had. "I can cook," she said. "I'm very good at it." "Silas will be glad to hear that," Callahan said. "He's been doing most of the cooking, and he'd be the first to tell you it's not his finest skill. I know herbs, medicinal ones. I've been keeping that knowledge since I was a girl. That's useful out here. I'm also not helpless," she said. "I want to be clear about that too. Whatever arrangement this becomes, if it becomes any kind of arrangement at all, I'm not someone you have to manage or take care of. I work." Callahan nodded once. "That's noted." "Then, for what it's worth, I'm not looking for someone to take care of any more than you're looking to be taken care of. I've got a working ranch that functions fine. I've got a room that's empty, and a table that's got more food on it than 2 men and a boy can work through in a week. That's all this is, if that's all you want it to be." If that's all you want it to be. There it was again. That question, hidden inside another sentence. What do you want? Like he intended to keep asking it until she had an answer that satisfied her. "I'll give it a week," Evelyn said. "Fair enough," said Wyatt Callahan. The ranch appeared at the end of the track as a cluster of lights in the dark, a main house, a barn, the bunkhouse off to the side, and the small separate cabin she would later learn he'd been using for storage until 2 weeks ago, when he'd cleared it out and added the lock from Jensen's Hardware. She would wonder, later, whether he'd done that, knowing something was coming or simply because it seemed like a reasonable thing to have. She didn't ask him that night. There were enough things to absorb without adding that one. He brought the wagon to a stop and climbed down and came around to her side. She climbed down herself before he could offer assistance, a preference, not a statement, though it came out looking like one. He didn't comment on it. He showed her to the small cabin by lantern light. The fireplace inside was laid but unlit. He knelt and lit it himself while she stood in the doorway and looked at the space, a clean wood floor, a bed with a frame and a real mattress and 2 folded quilts on top of it, a small table with a chair, a window with a curtain. Not much. There was a key hanging on a nail beside the door and a bolt on the inside just as he'd described. He stood up from the fire. "Kitchen's in the main house. You're welcome to it whenever you want it. Silas starts breakfast at first light if you want company, or whenever suits you if you don't." He moved toward the door. "There's a water basin and a pitcher on the table. I'll bring fresh water in the morning. I can get my own water," she said. "The well's around the side of the main house," he said, without arguing the point. "I'll show you in the morning." He stood in the doorway for a moment, hat in his hand, and looked at her, not the way Barrett looked at her, not the way any man in that saloon had looked at her tonight. He looked at her the way the man had looked at his cards, considering, honest, without performance. "You're safe here," he said. Just that. Not a promise loaded with expectation, not a bargain, not a setup for something else. Just a statement of fact, offered to someone who might need to hear it. Evelyn Harper looked at Wyatt Callahan standing in the doorway of the small cabin on his working ranch 4 miles east of Silver Creek, Montana, in the autumn of 1884. And she felt something she hadn't felt in so long that it took her several seconds to identify it. She believed him. "Good night, Mr. Callahan," she said. "Good night, ma'am," he said. He tipped his hat. He pulled the door closed behind him. Evelyn stood alone in the warm small room, with the fire beginning to push heat out into the corners and the quilt on the bed thick and clean, and the key hanging on the nail beside the door. And she locked the bolt, and she sat down on the edge of the bed, and she let herself shake for exactly as long as she needed to, before she was done. Then she lay down in the bed with her coat still on, and pulled the quilt over herself, and stared at the firelight moving across the ceiling. "Nobody belongs to anyone," he had said. She had heard those words with a different part of her than her ears. Something had received them in a way that went deeper than listening something that had been waiting, without knowing it was waiting. For someone to say that particular sentence to her, with that particular weight. She was 27 years old. She had never owned anything except the contents of the bag, at the foot of this bed and the knowledge in her head, and the work in her hands. She had been told in 100 different ways by 100 different people that the combination of her size and her poverty and her gender and her circumstances made her something to be arranged around rather than considered. She had never stopped knowing that was wrong. She had just, sometimes, stopped being able to hold on to that knowledge when the world pushed back hard enough. Tonight the world had done its worst, had sat her in a saloon and put her name on a piece of paper and laughed, and something had happened that she was still not entirely certain she hadn't imagined. A man she'd never met had said nobody belongs to anyone and meant it. Evelyn pressed her hand flat against the quilt and breathed. 1 week she had told him, she suspected she had lied. Outside the small cabin, the Montana night was cold and quiet and full of stars. In the main house, a lamp went out. In the barn, the horses shifted and settled. And in the small clearing between the buildings, the wind moved through the dry grass with the particular sound of October, not cold enough yet to be winter, not warm enough to be anything else. Suspended in the exact moment between one thing and the next. Evelyn Harper was 27 years old, and she had never had a room that locked from the inside. She was going to sleep better than she had in months. She did not yet know that this was only the beginning of all the ways this place was about to change her, or that she was about to change it right back. She did not yet know about Wyatt Callahan's silence, what lived inside it, how long he'd been carrying the particular weight she'd sensed in him across a smoky saloon. She did not yet know about Silas, who would have opinions about her biscuits and then be completely converted by them. She did not yet know about the townspeople of Silver Creek, who were currently processing the events of this evening and arriving at conclusions that would lead them straight back to her doorstep in ways she hadn't finished preparing herself for. She didn't know any of that yet. What she knew was the warmth of the fire and the weight of the quilt and the bolt on the door and the key on the nail. That was enough. That was for tonight absolutely everything. She was awake before first light. Not because anything woke her, no noise, no disturbance, no bad dream pulling her out of sleep. She woke because her body had spent so many years braced for the next thing that it had forgotten how to rest, all the way through to morning. 6 months in Barrett Holloway's house, she had learned to sleep lightly, to hear footsteps in the hall, to know the difference between the creak of a settling house and the creak of a door being tested. She had slept like a person who expected to need to be ready. She lay still for a moment in the dark, listening. The fire had burned down to coals. The cabin was cold at the edges and warm in the middle and completely, utterly silent except for the wind outside and the far-off sound of one of the horses in the barn shifting its weight. No footsteps, no voices, no sound of a door handle being tried. She sat up. reached for her coat that she'd finally taken off sometime in the night, and folded across the foot of the bed. Put it back on, sat on the edge of the mattress, and looked at the bolt on the door still thrown, just as she'd left it, and the key on the nail beside it, and the gray light beginning to show itself at the edges of the curtain over the window. First light. Silas started breakfast at first light, Callahan had said. She stood up, smoothed her dress as best she could, ran her hands through her hair, and did what she could with it, which was not as much as she would have preferred but was sufficient. She unbolted the door. She stepped outside into the cold. The sky was doing that particular thing it did in the last minutes before sunrise, going from black to a deep blue-gray, that made the mountains look like they'd been cut out of something darker and placed against it. Her breath made clouds. The ground was hard with cold. She found the well around the side of the main house, just where Callahan had said it would be. She drew water. She washed her face and hands with the kind of thorough attention that had nothing to do with vanity and everything to do with the simple dignity of starting a day clean. Then she looked at the main house, the kitchen window lit from inside, and she straightened her coat, and she walked toward it. The kitchen door was unlocked. She pushed it open. The man at the stove was not Callahan. He was older, somewhere north of 60, she guessed, with white hair cut short and a face that had been weathered by several decades of outdoor work into something that looked less skin and more like the map of a particularly eventful landscape. He was attempting to fry eggs in a pan that was too hot and managing the result with the resigned attention of a man who has accepted that this is what eggs do when he cooks them. He heard her come in and turned around. He looked at her. He looked at the eggs. He looked back at her. "You cook?" he said. "I do," Evelyn said. He held out the spatula without another word. She took it. She moved the pan off the hottest part of the stove, let it settle for a moment, moved it back. She found a cloth and used it as a grip and tilted the pan slightly and let the edges of the eggs firm up before touching them. She found bread near the window that had been sliced and not yet toasted and put 2 pieces near the heat. She found salt. She used it. The man was watching her from across the kitchen with his arms crossed and an expression that was working hard at being neutral and not entirely succeeding. "Silas," she said without turning around, "that's right." A pause. "Silas Boone. I've been cooking for this ranch going on 4 years. How have the eggs been?" Another pause. "Functional," he said, with the particular dignity of someone who knows they are losing an argument. Said Evelyn. She plated the eggs when they were done, properly cooked through but not leathered, the edges just catching color, and set both plates on the table. She added the toast. She found the coffee that was already made and poured 2 cups and set them down and then stood back. Silas walked to the table. He sat down. He looked at the eggs. He picked up his fork, cut into one, put it in his mouth, and chewed. He was quiet for a long moment. "Well," he said. "Well," Evelyn agreed. She sat down across from him and picked up her own fork. "Callahan said you'd be here," Silas said. He was eating steadily now, the kind of eating that happens when something is actually worth eating. "Said you needed somewhere to land for a spell." He was right about that. "He tell you what happened in there last night?" Silas asked. "Or did you see it yourself?" "I was there," Evelyn said. Silas made a low sound in his throat. "Barrett Holloway," he said, and the 2 words carried about 15 years' worth of opinion compressed into 4 syllables. "Known that man since he came to this territory. Never met a soul more dedicated to finding someone else to blame for his own poor choices." He took a drink of coffee. "You all right?" The question landed on her simply, without adornment. She looked at him across the table, this old man with his weathered face and his functional eggs, and his 4 years of cooking for a ranch that had apparently needed her to show up and handle the spatula. "I will be," she said. "That's the right answer," Silas said. Plenty of folks would have said fine. Fine's a lie people tell when they don't think you actually want to know. Wilby is honest. She looked at him. "You're a perceptive man for someone who was about to burn eggs at 6 in the morning. He pointed his fork at her. "And you got a mouth on you for someone who just sat down at a stranger's table." "Is that a complaint?" he considered. "No," he said. This ranch has been too quiet. Quiet ain't always peaceful. Sometimes it's just quiet. The back door of the kitchen opened. Cody came in. She learned his name shortly after, from Silas, a young man somewhere around 20, with the rangy build of someone who had grown several inches recently and hadn't entirely caught up with it. He stopped dead when he saw Evelyn, looked at Silas, looked back at Evelyn, and then looked at the plate on the table, with the expression of someone who has just noticed something deeply important. "Are those eggs?" he said. "Yes," said Silas. "Those are the best-looking eggs I have ever seen on this table," Cody said, with the complete sincerity of someone who has been eating functional eggs for a considerable period of time. "Sit down," Evelyn said, and stood up to make him a plate. She didn't think about it. She just did it, because there was food and he was hungry, and that was the arithmetic of kitchens, simple and absolute. She heard him drop into a chair. She heard Silas make a small sound that might have been amusement. She put the plate in front of Cody and went back to her own seat, and they all three ate together in the easy quiet of people who have not yet decided what they are to each other, but have tacitly agreed that breakfast is not the moment to work it out. Callahan came in at the tail end of it. He'd been up earlier than any of them. She could tell from the state of him, from the cold air that came in with him, from the way his hands moved to the coffee without any of the slowness of someone newly woken. He had already been out in the barn, or the east pasture, or somewhere that work happened before the sun cleared the mountains. He poured his coffee and turned and registered her presence at his kitchen table. With the same expression he seemed to bring to most things, calm, aware, giving nothing away above what the situation required. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she said. He sat down. Looked at the plate Silas put in front of him. Looked at Silas. Silas shrugged with elaborate innocence. Callahan cut into the eggs, ate, and was quiet for a moment. "You didn't have to do this," he said. "I was up," Evelyn said. The kitchen was there. It's not a complicated equation. "Still, Mr. Callahan," she said, and waited until he looked at her. "I told you last night I work. I meant it. If I'm going to be in this house, I'm not going to sit in that cabin and wait for someone to bring me meals. That's not who I am." He looked at her steadily. "All right," he said. "I'm not asking permission," she added. "I'm explaining myself." Silas made a sound into his coffee cup that was definitely a laugh disguised as something else. "I hear the difference," Callahan said. Something in his expression had shifted slightly, not quite amusement, not quite respect, something that existed in the space between them. "You can have the kitchen," Evelyn said. And she drank her coffee. The days that followed moved with the particular rhythm of a working ranch in early November, which was the rhythm of things that needed doing, regardless of what else was happening, animals that needed feeding, fences that needed checking, equipment that needed maintaining against the coming winter. Evelyn found her place inside that rhythm within the first 3 days, not because anyone assigned her a place, but because she looked for the gaps and filled them, which was what she had always done in every situation, and which came as naturally to her as breathing. The kitchen became hers in the specific way that any space becomes a person's, not through declaration, but through accumulated presence. She learned where Silas kept things and rearranged them in ways that made more sense to her, which led to 3 days of Silas complaining at length about not being able to find the salt, which led to her showing him exactly where the salt was every single time he asked, with a patience so complete it eventually made him laugh despite himself. She discovered that the garden plot behind the main house had been let go. The soil was decent but neglected, the beds overgrown, the late-season remnants of whatever had been planted the previous spring gone to seed and tank. She asked Callahan about it one afternoon when she found him in the yard mending a piece of tack. "The garden," she said. "What about it? Who was keeping it?" He was quiet for a moment, working the leather through his hands. "My wife," he said. Before, she had heard, in the way you hear things in small territories through Silas's careful silences and Cody's occasional unguarded comments, that there had been a wife. That she had been gone for several years. That it had been the kind of loss that didn't make a man angry, but made him smaller, quieter, more careful about what he let himself want. "I'd like to take it over," Evelyn said. "If you don't object." He looked at the garden plot, looked back at his hands. "It's been empty long enough," he said. "Do what you want with it." She started on it the next morning with a determination that surprised even Silas, who came out to watch her work with the expression of someone observing a natural phenomenon. It was too late in the season for most planting. She knew that, but she could clear it and turn the soil and prepare it for spring, and she could put in cold, hardy greens that would produce through the early winter. She could see what the soil needed. She could plan it. She was on her knees in the third bed, working out the roots of something that had gone completely wild, when Cody wandered over and crouched beside her. "What's that?" he asked, pointing at a plant she'd set aside. "Yarrow," she said. "Good for wounds. Helps stop bleeding when you pack it in." He looked at it with new interest. "You know a lot about plants?" "My grandmother taught me," Evelyn said. She sat back on her heels, brushing dirt from her hands. She knew every medicinal plant in this territory. She could tell you what to use for a fever, what to use for pain, what to give a child who couldn't sleep. Doctors were hard to find where I grew up. Women like her were the medicine. Cody was quiet for a moment, turning the yarrow over in his hands carefully. "Silas has trouble with his knee," he said, "in the cold. It swells up something bad." Evelyn looked at him. "I know what helps with that," she said. "I'll need to find a few things, but most of them should be around here if I look." Cody looked at her with an expression that was young and unguarded and something she recognized after a moment as genuine relief, the kind that comes from feeling like a problem you'd been carrying quietly had just found a possible solution. "He won't complain about it," he said. "He never complains." "But I can see it hurts him." "I know," Evelyn said. "Men like Silas never complain. That doesn't mean it doesn't hurt." Cody thought about that. "How do you know about men like Silas when you just met him?" "Because I've known men like Silas my whole life," she said. "Good, stubborn men who think asking for help is the same as admitting defeat. They're everywhere." She paused. "So are the people who learn to help them without asking." Cody absorbed this. Then he said, "I can show you where the wild plants grow on the east side of the property." "I know that whole stretch." "I'd appreciate that," Evelyn said. And just like that, over a piece of yarrow and a boy's concern for an old man's knee, another thing became true that hadn't been true before. She was not a guest anymore. She was not sure yet what she was, exactly. But she was not a guest. The first real test came 9 days after she arrived, and it came from the direction she had least expected, which was from the town. She was in the kitchen in the late morning when she heard a wagon pull up outside. She heard Callahan's voice, and then another voice, a woman's, which was unusual enough at the ranch that she paused in what she was doing and listened. The voices had an edge to them that the conversation between Callahan and his regular hands never had. She went to the window and looked out. The woman in the wagon was somewhere in her late 40s, well dressed by Silver Creek standards, which meant a good coat and a hat with a proper brim and gloves. Evelyn recognized the type before she could recognize the face. The kind of woman who organized church socials and kept track of other people's business with the thoroughness of a bookkeeper and the righteousness of someone who had decided that social order was God's work, and she had been specifically appointed to maintain it. "She can't stay here, Callahan," the woman was saying. Her voice carried with the confidence of someone accustomed to having it carry. "It's not appropriate. A woman alone on a man's property, no family connection, no proper arrangement." "Her arrangement is with me," Callahan said. He was standing beside the wagon with his arms at his sides and his voice even register it always occupied, which Evelyn was beginning to understand was more formidable than if he'd raised it. "And it's my property. People let them," he said. "Callahan." The woman's voice dipped into something that wanted to be concern but had cruelty at its center. "She's not the kind of woman a man like you needs on his property. You've worked hard for your reputation in this valley. What happened in that saloon is one thing everyone understands. You felt obliged to act. But letting her stay, letting her run your household." "She's not running my household," Callahan said. "She's a person who needed somewhere to be. This ranch has the space. She's that plus-size woman Barrett Holloway had working for him. The woman said it with the particular precision of someone delivering what they consider to be a decisive piece of information. Everyone knows about her. She has no family, no standing, no... Mrs. Crane. Callahan's voice didn't change volume, but something in it shifted, the way a river shifts when you realize the current is stronger than it looked from the bank. I want you to think carefully about the next thing you say. The woman, Mrs. Crane, stopped. She had heard something in his voice, clearly, because she sat back slightly in the wagon seat, and her next words came out with less force than the previous ones. I'm only saying what people are going to say, Callahan. I'm trying to help you. I know what you're trying to do, he said. I appreciate it about as much as I appreciate most advice I didn't ask for. Evelyn pressed her back against the wall of the kitchen, away from the window, and stood very still with her heart going at a pace considerably faster than the conversation outside warranted. She was listening to a man defend her presence to a woman who had never met her defend it, not with excuses or apologies or careful explanations of why she wasn't a threat to anyone's propriety, but simply by refusing to accept the premise that her presence required defense. She heard Mrs. Crane make one more attempt. She heard Callahan's response, which was shorter than his previous ones, and contained a politeness so pointed it functioned as a dismissal. She heard the wagon turn and pull away. She was back at the stove when he came in through the kitchen door. He poured coffee. He stood at the counter and drank it without immediately saying anything, which she had come to understand was his particular way of arriving at conversations he needed a moment, always, before words, to decide exactly what the words were going to be. You heard that, he said. The kitchen isn't that big, she said. Crane means well, he said, and the tone of it made clear that he didn't entirely believe this but was choosing to say it anyway. She's got strong ideas about how things should be. So do I, Evelyn said. I know it. He turned to look at her. I want you to know it doesn't change anything here. What she thinks, what anyone in that town thinks. Evelyn set down the spoon she'd been using and turned to face him properly. She studied his face, looking for the thing that was underneath the steadiness, the motivation, the calculation. Whatever it was that explained why a man she had known for 9 days was standing in his kitchen telling her the other people's opinions about her didn't change things. Why, she asked. Why what? Why doesn't it change anything, she said. It would change things for most people. A woman like Mrs. Crane talking in town, making it difficult most men would have reconsidered by now. Found a reason why the arrangement wasn't working out. Nobody would blame you for it. It would be easy. Callahan was quiet for a moment. Then he set down his coffee cup and looked at her with the directness that was. She was beginning to understand. Simply the way he looked at things without deflection. Without the extra layer of performance that most people added when they were being watched. Because easy ain't always right, he said. I figured that out a while ago. When he was quiet for a longer moment this time. When I let easy keep me from doing things I should have done, he said. It's a long list. I'm not interested in adding to it. She looked at him. He looked at her. Something passed between them in that kitchen that wasn't quite a conversation, but was more than silence and acknowledgement, maybe, that they were both people who had been shaped by particular losses. And that this was the ground they were standing on, and that they had both decided, independently, to stand on it anyway. The yarrow preparation I made for Silas's knee, she said. He needs to keep the compress on for at least 30 minutes twice a day to get the full benefit. Callahan blinked. Then I'll tell him. He won't do it on his own, Evelyn said. He'll do it twice and then decide he doesn't have time. He will, Callahan agreed. I'll make sure he does it. Good. She picked up her spoon. Thank you, she added. And she meant it for more than the information about Silas. And he knew it, and neither of them said so directly. Because some things in a working ranch kitchen between two people who are still figuring out the geography of each other are better left in the space where they land than picked up and examined in the open. She started to turn back to the stove, Evelyn. She turned around. He almost never used her first name, it was always ma'am, which she had stopped objecting to, because she had come to understand that it was not dismissal, it was respect. The particular Western idiom of treating a woman as a person worth addressing properly. He was holding something out to her across the kitchen. She looked at it, a small seed catalog, well-worn, some pages dog-eared and some loose. She recognized it as the kind of thing that had been on the shelf in the front room, the kind of object that had been in the house for years, without anyone particularly noticing. "For the garden," he said, "in case you want to plan out the spring planting. There's notes in the margins from before." A pause. "You don't have to use them. Just thought it might be useful." She crossed the kitchen and took it from him. She looked at the cover-faded print, a few years old, and then she opened it and saw the handwriting in the margins. A woman's handwriting, neat, precise, opinionated notes about what had done well and what had failed, and what she wanted to try differently. Sentences like "too much shade on the east side," "move the beans," and "this variety does better than they claim." Evelyn stood in the kitchen of Wyatt Callahan's ranch and held his dead wife's seed catalog in her hands and understood exactly what it had cost him to take it off the shelf and carry it across the room and hold it out to her. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was very steady, and she was proud of it. "I'll leave you to your work," he said, and he picked up his hat from the table and went back outside. She stood there for a long moment, holding the catalog. Then she sat down at the kitchen table and opened it to the first page and started to read the notes in the margins, and she let herself feel, for the first time in 9 days, the full weight of what was happening to her, not with fear. Not with suspicion, but with something cautious and bewildered and terribly dangerously close to hope. The hope was what scared her most. She had learned over years that hope was the most expensive thing a person with nothing could afford. It cost more than food, more than shelter, more than any practical necessity, because when it broke, you paid the bill in something you could never earn back. She had paid that bill too many times. She had let herself believe, with Barrett, that things were different, and they hadn't been, and the cost of that particular miscalculation had ended with her name on a piece of paper on a poker table while a room full of men laughed. But Wyatt Callahan had torn that paper in half, and he had a lock from Jensen's Hardware on the door of the small cabin. And he had walked across his kitchen and held out a dead woman's seed catalog because he thought it might be useful for the spring planting. She pressed her hand flat against the open page and took a long breath. 1 week, she had told him. She had been here 9 days. The days continued. The weather moved toward the hard cold of a Montana November, and the ranch moved with it preparations, adjustments, the practical labor of getting a property through a long winter. Evelyn threw herself into it with the full force of someone who has discovered that work, real work with a purpose attached to it, is one of the best remedies for the kind of uncertainty she was living inside. She mended everything that needed mending: coats, blankets, work gloves, Cody's good shirt that he'd put a tear in and hadn't mentioned to anyone. She organized the root cellar with a thoroughness that made Silas go down there afterward and stand in the doorway for 30 seconds just looking at it. She identified 3 plants on the east side of the property, which Cody showed her as promised, that she could use to supplement her preparations, not just for Silas's knee, but for the winter colds she knew were coming. For the cuts and minor injuries that were simply the ongoing tax of ranch work. Silas's knee improved. He did not say so directly. What he did was stop sitting down so carefully when he came into the kitchen for meals, and stop favoring his left side when he walked to the barn. And one afternoon Evelyn overheard him telling Cody that the cold wasn't as bad as it usually was this year, which they both understood was a remarkable piece of fiction on his part and accepted without comment. What he did say, one morning when they were alone in the kitchen and she was making bread and he was ostensibly repairing a harness buckle but mostly watching her work, was, "You planning to stay?" She didn't look up from the dough. "I'm here." "That ain't the same thing," he said. She worked the dough. "I know it. Callahan won't ask you," Silas said. "He's not built for asking. He does things. He holds doors open and locks bolts and hands you seed catalogs and figures you'll understand what he means by it." Evelyn looked at him now. "You know about the catalog." Silas shrugged, which on his face was an extraordinarily expressive gesture. "I've been on this ranch 6 years. I watched him carry that catalog around for 2 of them after Margaret died. Couldn't put it away, couldn't read it either, just kept it on the shelf where she left it. He went back to the buckle. He took it down last week. She absorbed this. He's not a complicated man," Silas said in the tone of someone who means the opposite. "He's just private. There's a difference. Complicated men are hiding something. Private men are protecting something." "What's he protecting?" Evelyn asked. Silas looked at her steadily. "Same thing you are," he said. "The last piece of themselves they've got left." She put the bread in to bake and cleaned her hands, and did not respond to this, because there was nothing to say to it that wouldn't be either a lie or more truth than she was ready to stand in a kitchen and offer up to a man she'd known for less than 2 weeks, however perceptive he happened to be. But she thought about it. She thought about it for the rest of that day, and into the evening. And she was still thinking about it when she sat in the small cabin, with the fire going, and the seed catalog open in her lap, and a piece of paper beside her, where she was mapping out the garden beds, for spring, where she would put the beans, where the herbs would get the right light, which corner would shelter the more delicate plants from the prevailing wind. It was a plan for spring. Spring was 5 months away. She looked at the paper. She looked at the map she was drawing, careful, considered, the work of someone who expected to be here long enough for it to matter. She thought about what Silas had said, "Same thing you are." She thought about the seed catalog and the lock from Jensen's Hardware, and a man who said nobody belongs to anyone, to a room full of people who believed otherwise. Not because he was trying to impress anyone, but because it was simply what he believed, and he saw no reason not to say it. She folded the paper carefully, set it inside the catalog. Set the catalog on the table beside the bed. She was making plans for spring. She was going to stop pretending that was an accident. She did not know, lying in the dark with the fire low and the cold coming in at the window edges, that 2 days from now a rider would come from Silver Creek with news that Barrett Holloway had not gone quietly. That he had spent the past 2 weeks in the saloon telling anyone who would listen that the contract was legal, that Callahan had stolen something that belonged to him, that a man's bet was a man's word, and Callahan had no right to tear it up. That he had found, in a town 3 days' ride east, a corrupt official named Dunmore who had opinions about frontier property law and could be persuaded to share them in writing for the right amount of money. She did not know any of that yet. What she knew, in that moment, was the weight of a catalog on the table beside her, and a plan for spring on a piece of paper tucked inside it, and outside the locked door of the small cabin. The sounds of a working ranch settling into the deep cold of a November night. She was still afraid. That was honest. She was still afraid, and the hope still scared her, and she still woke too early with her body braced for the next thing. But she was making plans for spring, and for Evelyn Harper, who had spent years being arranged around by other people's plans, that was not a small thing. That was in fact everything. The rider came on a Tuesday. Evelyn heard the hoofbeats from the garden, where she was turning the last of the cold season beds before the ground froze solid. She heard Callahan's voice from the yard, then a second voice she didn't recognize, then a silence that was the specific kind of silence that happens when someone has just said something that requires his moment to absorb. She set down her spade. She came around the side of the main house and saw a young man on horseback, one of the Granger boys, she thought, from the way Silas had described them, holding out a folded piece of paper to Callahan, with the expression of someone who is delivering a message they'd rather not be delivering. Callahan took the paper, opened it, read it. She watched his face. She had become, in the past 11 days, a careful student of that face, not because she was romantic about it, but because she was practical. Because in her experience, the face of the person who had the most power in your immediate situation was the important thing to understand. She had learned his tells, the small tightening at the corner of his jaw when something required more patience than he naturally had. The way his eyes went very still when he was deciding something. The particular set of his shoulders when the decision had been made. All three of those things happened now, in sequence, while he read that paper. "Tell whoever sent you that I got the message," Callahan said to the Granger boy. His voice was even. The boy nodded, turned his horse, and left at a pace that suggested he wanted to be somewhere else as quickly as possible. Callahan stood holding the paper. "What is it?" Evelyn said. He looked at her. He didn't hesitate. She appreciated that, later, when she had time to appreciate things. He didn't try to soften it, or navigate around it, or decide she couldn't handle it. He simply walked over to her and held out the paper. She read it. It was a formal document, not quite official, not quite legal, but dressed up in the language of both. It bore the name of a man called Douglas Dunmore, identified as a land and contract assessor out of Billings. And it stated in the kind of careful bureaucratic language designed to sound more authoritative than it was that the contract between Barrett Holloway and Evelyn Harper, being a work arrangement of record, had not been legally voided by the destruction of a single copy, and that the outstanding terms of said arrangement required resolution in a public proceeding to be held at the Silver Creek Courthouse in 4 days' time. She read it twice. Then she folded it along its original creases and held it out to Callahan. "Barrett," she said. "Barrett," he confirmed. "He found someone to write this." "He found someone to write this," Callahan said. "Dunmore's been known to find legal language for whatever a man's willing to pay for. He operates out of Billings, but he'll come as far as Silver Creek for the right amount." Evelyn looked out at the place where the Granger boy had ridden away. She felt the cold coming off the ground, coming through the soles of her boots, working its way up. She felt the familiar tightening in her chest that she recognized as fear, and that she refused to give more room than it strictly required. "What happens at the proceeding?" she asked. "Dunmore presents the contract as valid. Barrett claims you're obligated under its terms. Someone, probably me, argues otherwise. And then, depends on who Dunmore has in his pocket," Callahan said. "And how many people in that courthouse are more interested in seeing Barrett satisfied than in doing what's right?" She turned to look at him directly. "Could he take me back?" Callahan met her eyes without flinching. "He's going to try," he said. "I'm going to make sure he doesn't succeed. That's not the same as a guarantee." He said it's not. She appreciated the honesty. She would have hated a guarantee, would have known it for the lie it was, and it would have made her trust him less, and she needed to trust him right now more than she was entirely comfortable admitting. She breathed out, breathed in, looked at the garden bed she'd been turning when the rider came, the soil dark and cold and ready for spring. "Then we'd better figure out what we're going to do," she said. What they did over the following 4 days was prepare. Callahan rode into Silver Creek the next morning and came back with 3 things. A conversation with the county sheriff, whose name was Aldridge, and who was a man of middling integrity and very strong preference for avoiding conflict, a name. That of a man in Billings who actually understood territorial contract law and who could send a written opinion in time if they sent a rider today. And the information that Barrett Holloway had been spending money in Silver Creek for 2 weeks buying rounds at the Iron Horse, being generous with men who had influence, making sure that everyone who was going to be in that courthouse in 4 days felt in some vague way that they owed him something. "He's been working the room," Evelyn said when Callahan told her this. "He has, while I've been here." "While you've been here," he confirmed. She sat with that for a moment. Barrett Holloway, methodical in his ruin, buying goodwill with money he'd probably borrowed against a future he was trying to manufacture. She had underestimated his persistence. She didn't intend to make that mistake again. "Who's going to be in that courthouse?" she asked. Callahan listed them: the assessor Dunmore, the sheriff, 3 town council members who served as witnesses for proceedings of this kind. Whatever townspeople chose to attend, which in Silver Creek, for an event of this nature, would be most of them. "Mrs. Crane," Evelyn said. "Almost certainly," he said. "Will she speak against me?" He considered it honestly. "She'll speak for what she thinks is proper," he said. "Which, depending on how the proceeding goes, might not be entirely in your favor." "Silas, who had been listening from the far side of the kitchen with the studious nonchalance of a man who had decided this conversation was not his business and was attending to it anyway, set down the harness he'd been holding. "I'll come," he said. Callahan looked at him. "I've been in this valley longer than Dunmore's been breathing borrowed air," Silas said. "I know every man who's going to be in that room. Some of them I've known since they were young enough to be stupid without consequences." He paused. "Might be useful to have someone there who can remind people what their word used to mean." Callahan started. "I'm coming," Silas said with finality. "That's settled." Evelyn looked at the old man across the kitchen and felt something move through her chest that she couldn't have named precisely, but that had to do with the specific grace of being bended, without having asked for it. Cody, from the doorway, said, "I'll come too." "You're 20 years old," Silas said. "I know how to stand in a room," Cody said, with the dignity of someone who is aware their qualifications are limited and has decided to offer what they have. Nobody argued with him. The 4 days moved both too slowly and too fast, the way time always moves when you are waiting for something you cannot control. Evelyn cooked and worked, and did not let herself sit still long enough to think too hard about what was coming. She finished turning the garden beds. She started a preparation of elderberry and echinacea that would be useful through the winter, and that gave her hands something to do. She mended the last of the things that needed mending, and she reorganized the root cellar a second time because the first organization had revealed inefficiencies she'd been thinking about. And she read every margin note in the seed catalog twice and started a letter to the seed company about spring orders. Callahan found her at the kitchen table at 11 o'clock on the second night, still awake, the seed catalog in front of her, and the lamp low. He stood in the doorway for a moment. "You should sleep," he said. "So should you," she said without looking up. "You rode to Silver Creek and back today, and you were in the east pasture before I was up this morning." He came in and poured himself water from the pitcher on the counter. He stood at the counter and drank it and looked at her. "You're not actually reading that catalog," he said. She looked down at it. The page she was on was the section on root vegetables, and she had read the same paragraph about parsnip varieties 4 times without retaining any of it. "No," she admitted, "I'm not. What are you thinking about?" She closed the catalog and pressed her hand flat on the cover. "I'm thinking about the fact that in 2 days a man with a bought piece of paper is going to stand in a courthouse and tell a room full of people that I belong to him," she said. "And I'm thinking about all the people in that room who are going to be inclined to believe him, not because the paper is legitimate, but because it's easier to believe that a woman like me is something to be arranged than something to be listened to." Callahan set down his water glass. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down in it and looked at her steadily. "A woman like you," he said. "What does that mean?" She met his eyes. "You know what it means. I want to hear what you think it means." She was quiet for a moment. Then a woman with no family, no money, no standing. A woman who is large and plain and has been working other people's houses since she was 16. A woman who ended up in a poker game. She said it flatly. Without self-pity, these were facts, and she dealt in facts she always had. That's the version of me that walks into that courthouse. That's what Barrett is counting on. That room will look at me and see something with a price on it. "And what will you do about that?" Callahan said. She looked at him. "I'll walk in anyway," she said. "What else would I do?" Something moved across his face. She had seen that look before. Briefly in the saloon, in the moment before he tore the paper, in the particular second when he'd decided. It was not admiration exactly, or at least not only that. It was something more like recognition, like seeing something he'd suspected was true and having it confirmed. "I'll be standing next to you," he said. "You'll be standing next to me," she said, "but I'll be the one speaking." He was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. "I mean it, Callahan. I'm not going into that courthouse to be rescued. I'm going to say what needs to be said. In my own words. And then after a pause, I wouldn't have it any other way." She looked at him across the kitchen table, and she thought about what Silas had said. Private men are protecting something, and she thought about a man who had ridden 4 miles in the cold to get a sheriff's conversation and a legal opinion and came home and sat down at a kitchen table at 11 o'clock at night and asked her what she was thinking, rather than telling her what he planned to do. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For asking," she said. Instead of just deciding, he was quiet. "Then it's your life," he said simply. "Seems like you ought to have a say in it." She put the seed catalog on the shelf and went to bed, and for the first time in 4 days, she slept through to morning. The courthouse at Silver Creek was the kind of building that had been constructed with ambitions toward importance. A solid wood frame, high ceilings, a raised platform at the front for proceedings. On the morning of the hearing, it was filled with the particular mixture of people that small frontier towns produced for public events: the genuinely interested, the bored, the performatively concerned, and those who simply had nowhere else to be and considered other people's difficulties a reasonable way to spend a morning. Evelyn walked in beside Callahan with Silas on her left and Cody behind them, and she looked straight ahead and did not make the mistake of checking anyone's face for their opinion, because she had learned long ago that looking for other people's approval was one of the fastest ways to talk yourself out of the things you needed to do. Barrett Holloway was already there. He looked, she thought, like a man who had convinced himself he was about to win the particular set of his shoulders, the way he held his hands, the slight elevation of his chin. He had dressed carefully for this. He had brought Douglas Dunmore, who was a thin man in a good coat, with the expression one who charges by the hour and is not running a discount. Dunmore surveyed Evelyn as she came in the way you survey a piece of property, whose documentation you've been hired to validate. She looked back at him with an expression that communicated, as clearly as a closed door, that she was aware of exactly what he was doing and intended to make it difficult. The sheriff, Aldridge, called the proceeding to order with the weary authority of a man who has already decided this morning is going to be trouble and is trying to get through it in one piece. He stated the matter at hand, the question of the validity of a work contract, the destruction of said contract, and the obligations arising or not arising from both. Dunmore spoke first. He was practiced at this, at making flimsy things sound solid through the density of language, at using legal-adjacent vocabulary to create the impression of authority. He presented Barrett's contract, or rather a copy of it, which he stated was identical to the original. He made arguments about frontier labor agreements. He used words like obligation and term of service and willful breach, with the confidence of someone who has found that most people won't challenge vocabulary they don't immediately understand. The room listened. Evelyn watched the faces, some skeptical, some nodding, some carefully neutral. Mrs. Crane was in the third row with her hat and her gloves and an expression of invested attention. When Dunmore finished, Callahan stood up. He stated, plainly and without performance, that the contract was not a legitimate work agreement, but an attempt to transfer a person's autonomy through a gambling debt. That no court in Montana Territory had the authority to enforce such an arrangement. And that the legal opinion he had received from a contract attorney in Billings, which he produced and handed to Sheriff Aldridge, supported this position thoroughly. Aldridge looked at the opinion. Dunmore objected to its introduction. Aldridge overruled the objection with the expression of a man who is relieved to have something concrete to look at. Barrett stood up. "The woman worked for me," he said. His voice was loud, carrying, aimed at the room rather than the sheriff. 6 months, I housed her, fed her, gave her wages. That's a contract whether or not it's on paper. And she walked out of my employ without notice and without. Mr. Holloway. Aldridge's voice was tired. This is a proceeding, not a saloon argument. Sit down or I'll have you removed. Barrett sat down. But he looked at the room as he did it, making sure everyone saw the injustice he was performing. Then Evelyn stood up. The room went quiet in the way it had gone quiet in the saloon, that specific frontier quiet that happens when something unexpected interrupts the expected shape of things. A woman standing up to speak in a courthouse proceeding in Silver Creek, Montana, in 1884 was not unprecedented, but it was not common. And the room adjusted itself to this new information, with the slight reshuffling of bodies and attention that large groups of people perform when something has surprised them. She did not look at Barrett. She did not look at Dunmore. She looked at Sheriff Aldridge, because he was the only person in the room whose opinion had any legal weight, and she had decided exactly what she was going to say. "I worked for Barrett Holloway for 6 months," she said. Her voice was steady. It was the voice of someone who has spent a long time being quiet in rooms that didn't want to hear her and has decided today to be heard anyway. "I cooked his meals and cleaned his house and managed his accounts, which he kept in considerable disorder. He paid me inconsistently and less than we agreed. When he ran out of money at that poker table, he put my name on a piece of paper without my knowledge or consent. I was not consulted. I was not asked. I was told to sit down and be quiet while men decided my future around a card table." She paused. "Let that sit. I am standing here today because Miss Callahan destroyed that paper and offered me a choice. Barrett Holloway is asking this court to tell me that I didn't have the right to make that choice. That a man's gambling debt gives him authority over where I live and how I spend my time and who I answer to." She looked at Aldridge directly. "I am asking this court to tell him that it does not." The room was very quiet. Ma'am, Dunmore started. "I wasn't speaking to you," Evelyn said without looking at him. Someone in the back of the room made a sound. It might have been a laugh. It might have been a sharp exhale of surprise. Whatever it was, it moved through the crowd like a current and shifted something. Silas stood up from his seat. He did it slowly, with the deliberate gravity of a man who has earned the right to take up space in rooms. "Sheriff Aldridge," he said, "I've been in this valley 20 years. I knew John Aldridge, your father and your grandfather before him. The law in this territory has always held that a person's labor is not property. Whatever Barrett Holloway wants to call that paper, a contract, an arrangement, a bet, what he's actually asking is for this court to say that a woman's life can be staked in a card game." He looked at the room, not at Aldridge. "I'd like every man in this room to think about whether that's a law they want their daughters to live under." The silence after that was different, heavier, the kind that happens when a room realizes it has been thinking about something the wrong way and is in the process of correcting. Mrs. Crane in the third row shifted in her seat. Barrett stood up again. "This is not about daughters," he said, and there was a desperation starting to show at the edges of his composure now, the confidence fracturing, under the weight of the room, turning against the shape of his argument. "This is about a legal obligation. She worked for me." She owes you 6 months of inconsistent wages," Callahan said. He hadn't raised his voice once. "You can submit a claim for back payment if you believe she left without proper notice. That's the legal recourse available to you." He looked at Dunmore. "Write that down if you need to." Dunmore did not write it down. Dunmore was looking at the room with the expression of a man who is reassessing whether he has been paid enough for this particular morning. Aldridge cleared his throat. He looked at the Billings attorney's opinion. He looked at Barrett. He looked at Evelyn. He was a man of middling integrity and very strong preference for avoiding conflict, and what he was doing now, visibly, was calculating which resolution produced the least conflict in the long run, which was, Evelyn suspected, how most of the actual decisions in Silver Creek got made. "I'm going to rule that the contract as presented is not enforceable," Aldridge said. "A work arrangement does not transfer personal obligation through a third party without the knowledge or consent of the individual concerned. Mr. Holloway's legal remedy, should he choose to pursue it, is a wage dispute claim." He brought down the small wooden block that served as a gavel. "This proceeding is closed." The room erupted, not in violence, nothing so dramatic. In the specific noise of 40 people, simultaneously beginning conversations they'd been holding back during the proceeding. Aldridge was already standing up. Dunmore was closing his papers with the brisk efficiency of a man ready to depart. And Barrett Holloway was standing in the middle of it, with his face going through a series of expressions that moved from disbelief through fury, and arrived at something that looked, underneath all of it, like the first honest thing she'd seen from him since she'd met him. Shame. He looked at Evelyn across the room, and for just a moment, just 1 second, before his pride pulled the curtain back down, she saw it. He knew, he had known, probably, since the saloon, that what he had done was wrong, and he had spent 2 weeks and considerable money trying to construct a reality in which it wasn't. And the construction had just fallen apart in front of everyone he'd been trying to convince, including himself. She didn't feel triumph. She felt tired and clear and very solid on her feet. Barrett pushed through the crowd toward the door. He didn't look back. She watched him go, and then she turned away, because watching him leave was not something that required her attention. Silas was at her elbow. He said, "I am," she said. And this time it was true. Cody was behind her, wide-eyed and flushed with the specific excitement of someone who has witnessed something significant for the first time. "You didn't even look nervous," he said. "I was terrified," Evelyn said. "You didn't look it. That's the whole trick," she said. "Looking like you're not." Callahan appeared beside her. He didn't say anything immediately. He never said anything immediately, but he stood close enough that his arm was almost touching hers, which was about as close as he'd ever stood, and she understood it for what it was. "Let's go home," he said. She looked at him. The word sat in the air between them, home, and she didn't correct it, and she didn't qualify it, and she didn't add any of the careful distance she'd been adding to everything for the past 2 weeks. "Yes," she said. "Let's." They moved toward the door together, the four of them, Callahan, Silas, Cody. And Evelyn and the crowd parted for them, with the particular deference of people who have just watched someone win something, and are still deciding how they feel about it. They were almost to the door when Mrs. Crane appeared. Evelyn saw her coming and felt something tighten in her jaw. She had managed the courthouse, Barrett, Dunmore, and a room full of strangers, and she was not sure she had anything left for Mrs. Crane right now, but she was not going to show that either, so she stopped and she waited. Mrs. Crane looked at her. The woman's face was doing something complicated, the expression of someone in the process of revising an opinion they'd held with considerable certainty, which was not a comfortable process for anyone. She opened her mouth, closed it, looked at Callahan briefly. Looked back at Evelyn. "You spoke well," she said finally. In there. It was not an apology, it was not even entirely a compliment. But it was the furthest Mrs. Crane appeared capable of traveling in this moment, and Evelyn recognized it for the effort it represented. "Thank you, Mrs. Crane," she said. The woman gave a short nod. She looked as though she wanted to say something else, and had decided against it. She stepped aside. Evelyn walked out of the Silver Creek courthouse into the cold November air, and she stopped on the steps and she took a long, slow breath and let it out. Behind her, she heard Silas say something quietly to Cody. She heard Cody's low laugh. She heard Callahan's boots on the steps coming to stand beside her. They stood there for a moment, the two of them, looking out over the main street of Silver Creek with all its familiar buildings and familiar face, going about their familiar business. "It's not over," she said. "He'll be angry. He might try something else." "He might," Callahan agreed. "I'm not afraid of him." "I know you're not. I want to be clear that what I said in there, that I'll handle my own battles, I meant that." "I know you meant it." He was quiet for a moment. "Then, I also want to be clear that standing next to someone while they fight their own battle is not the same as fighting it for them." She looked at him sideways. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. It was simple, declarative, the kind of sentence that doesn't need anything added to it because it already contains everything it means. She thought about the locked cabin and the seed catalog and the man who'd said nobody belongs to anyone, to a room that believed otherwise. She thought about 11 days of coffee before sunrise and a garden she was planning for spring, and an old man whose knee had stopped hurting, and a boy who now knew what yarrow was for. She thought about the word home, said at the door of a courthouse, and how she hadn't corrected it. "All right," she said. They walked down the steps together into the street, and she didn't look back at the courthouse, and she didn't look for Barrett Holloway's retreating shape anywhere in the crowd, and she didn't catalog the faces of the people watching them go. She looked forward. That, she was beginning to understand, was the only direction that had ever mattered. But what she didn't yet know what none of them knew, walking 4 miles back to the ranch in the cold November afternoon, was that Barrett Holloway, sitting in the Iron Horse Saloon with a whiskey he hadn't paid for yet and a humiliation he hadn't finished feeling, was not yet done. He was only done losing gracefully, and a man without grace was a far more dangerous thing. Barrett Holloway left Silver Creek 3 days after the courthouse. Not quietly. Nothing Barrett did was quiet. He settled his tab at the Iron Horse by leaving behind a pocket watch that Holt Granger later discovered was worth considerably less than the amount owed. He told anyone who would listen that the valley had gone soft, that a man couldn't conduct honest business anymore, that Callahan had made a powerful enemy and would learn what that meant in time. He said these things loudly enough that they traveled 4 miles east to the ranch inside of a day, carried by Cody, who had heard them from the black slacksmith who had been in the saloon when Barrett made his exit. Evelyn listened to this report at the kitchen table and felt nothing that surprised her. "He's leaving," she said. "Looks like," Cody said. "Then the noise doesn't matter." She went back to the bread she was making. Men like Barrett always make noise when they leave. It's the only power they've got left. Cody looked at her for a moment with the expression he sometimes wore young and trying to understand something faster than his years quite allowed. "Aren't you scared he'll come back?" "I'm sure he'll come back, eventually," she said. "People like him always do, when they've run out of options somewhere else." She pressed the heels of her hands into the dough. "But I won't be waiting on it. I've got a garden to plan." He left. She kneaded the bread. And underneath the steadiness she was presenting to the kitchen, something was slowly, carefully unclenching a thing that had been held tight. For so long she'd stopped noticing the effort of holding it, releasing now in small increments. The way ice gives up a thaw, gradually then all at once. The week after the courthouse was different from the weeks before it, though she couldn't have pointed immediately to a single thing that had changed. The ranch was the same ranch, the work was the same work. Silas still complained about the salt in the wrong place, then found it immediately, and refused to acknowledge that he'd been wrong about its location. Cody still appeared at her elbow when she was working with the plants, asking questions with the thoroughness of someone who has discovered an interest and intends to follow it all the way down. But something had shifted in the particular quality of the silence between her and Callahan. Before the courthouse, the silence had been careful. Respectful, she had understood it to be, and genuine. He was not a man who spoke to fill space, but careful in the way of someone who has decided where the lines are and is committed to staying on his side of them. After the courthouse, the silence was still respectful and still genuine, but it had lost some of its carefulness. It had become the silence of people who have stood next to each other in a difficult place and come through it together, and no longer need to perform their distance quite so deliberately. She noticed it first one morning when she was copying her spring garden plan onto a clean piece of paper. The original had gotten wet and the ink had run on one corner, and he came into the kitchen and looked over her shoulder at what she was drawing and said, without ceremony, "You'll want to move the herb section another 6 feet east. That corner gets shadow from the barn roof from about 2 in the afternoon on." She had looked up at him, surprised not by the suggestion but by the ease of it, the way he'd offered it, as though looking over her shoulder at her plans and contributing to them was a thing they simply did. "How much shadow?" she said. "Enough to matter for the ones that need full sun. The hardier ones would be fine. Which herbs am I putting in the shade then?" He pulled out the chair beside her and sat down, and they spent the next 20 minutes with her notes and his memory of where the light fell, at what hours on that specific piece of ground, and at the end of it the garden plan was better. And neither of them remarked on the fact that he had just sat down beside her and planned a garden for the first time since his wife died. Silas, passing through the kitchen with a piece of equipment that needed no attention from the kitchen whatsoever, looked at the two of them bent over the paper and kept walking without saying a word, though the set of his shoulders on the way out suggested he was working very hard at not having an expression. The shift happened in other small ways. He started staying longer at the supper table after Silas and Cody went back to the bunkhouse not long, Not dramatically, just an extra cup of coffee's worth of time, maybe 10 minutes, during which they talked about practical things. What the cattle were doing, what the winter looked like based on the signs he could read in the land, whether the root cellar was stocked sufficiently. Practical things, but talked about in the particular way that conversation becomes when two people are using practical things to practice the larger and more complicated thing, which was the simple act of talking to each other without armor. One evening he told her about Margaret. He didn't lead into it. They were talking about the garden. She had asked about the soil on the far east side, whether it was worth amending or whether the drainage was too poor, and he said, Margaret tried roses on that side for 2 years running. They didn't take. Soil's wrong for it, and then he said she was stubborn about those roses. I think she knew by the second year they weren't going to make it, but she put him in anyway, because giving up on something she'd decided on wasn't in her nature. Evelyn looked at him carefully. He was looking at his coffee cup. She was like that about most things, he said. Once she decided something was worth doing, she did it until she knew one way or the other. Didn't matter what it cost her. How long were you married? Evelyn asked. 7 years, he said. Spring of 78. He was quiet. She was 29. Evelyn didn't say she was sorry. She had received enough empty condolence in her life to know that sorry, by itself, didn't carry such weight when what you needed was someone to sit in the same room with the fact of a thing and not flinch away from it. What was she like? Evelyn asked instead. He looked up. And the thing on his face when she asked, that the thing that moved through his expression at being given permission to talk about Margaret rather than around her, was enough to make Evelyn's chest ache in a way she didn't try to explain to herself. He talked for a long time. She listened, and when he was finished, when he had run the natural course of it, and the kitchen had gotten quiet again with the specific quiet of words that have done their work, he looked at her with an expression that was complicated in ways she didn't yet have language for. I haven't talked about her like that in a long time, he said. You should, Evelyn said. She sounds like someone worth talking about. He looked at her for a moment. You're a strange woman, Evelyn Harper, he said, and the way he said it quiet and certain, and without a trace of cruelty, made it the kindest thing anyone had said to her in years. I've been told, she said. He almost smiled. She was learning the geography of his almost smiles. There were more of them than she'd initially thought, living just below the surface of his face, requiring the right conditions to surface. Get some sleep, he said. He stood up and took his cup to the counter, and went to the back door and put on his coat. He paused with his hand on the door. Thank you, he said. For listening. Thank you for telling me, she said. He went out. She sat alone in the kitchen for a while after, with the lamp low and the fire settling, and she thought about a woman who had planted roses on unsuitable soil 2 years running because she'd decided they were worth trying. She thought about the seed catalog with its careful margin notes. She thought about what it meant to be in a house where someone had loved something before you arrived, and how that was different from the loneliness she'd expected, and how it was in fact the opposite of lonely, if you knew how to listen for it. The second week of December arrived with the first serious snow, and the snow changed the shape of everything. The ranch contracted inward, less time outside, more time in close quarters, the particular intimacy of people sharing warmth and work and meals when the world outside has made itself inhospitable. Evelyn had expected this to be difficult. In her experience, close quarters with people who had power over you produced a specific kind of tension that the cold made worse. What she discovered instead was that the Callahan Ranch in winter was a place where people knew how to be together. Silas played cards at the kitchen table in the evenings, badly and with elaborate protestations of skill, losing consistently to Cody, who had the face of someone incapable of strategy and the card sense of someone who had been paying attention for years. Callahan read he had more books than she'd expected, stacked in the front room with the studied disorder of someone who reads things and then puts them down wherever the reading ends. She borrowed one without asking and returned it without comment, and he noticed and said nothing. And the next evening there was another one on the kitchen table with no explanation, which she took and read and found she had opinions about that she tested on him over breakfast, and he had opinions back, and Silas watched this exchange with the expression of a man observing a chess match he has already decided the outcome of. She was happy. The realization arrived on a Tuesday afternoon without announcement, the way the most important realizations tend to, not at the dramatic moment, but at an ordinary one. She was making soup. Silas was snoring gently in the chair by the stove. Outside, she could hear Callahan and Cody in the yard, their voices coming in briefly when the wind shifted, some discussion about the fence line on the north side. The kitchen smelled of broth and wood smoke. She was happy. Not the desperate conditional kind she'd felt in the early months with Barrett, the kind that required not examining it too closely in case it turned out to have a false bottom. This was different. This was the solid, unspectacular kind that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need to, the kind that lives in soup and borrowed books and a garden planned for spring. She stirred the soup and let the feeling sit without picking it apart. Then the front door opened and Callahan came in from the cold, stamping snow from his boots, and she heard him say something to Cody in the hall, and she heard Cody laugh, a real laugh, unguarded, and she thought, yes. This is what it was supposed to feel like, this exact thing. The complication arrived, as complications tend to, precisely when things had gotten good enough to lose. It was Cody who brought the news, early on a Thursday morning, 2 weeks into December. He came into the kitchen before breakfast with a look on his face that she had learned to read, the look he wore when he was carrying something he didn't want to carry. "What is it?" she said immediately. "Ryder came in last night," he said. "Late. I was the one up." He looked at Callahan, who had come in behind him. "It's about Barrett." Callahan set down his coffee. "Tell me." "He's in Billings," Cody said. "He's been there 3 weeks. He's been talking to men, not lawyers this time." "Men." He paused, and the pause told her everything about what kind of men he meant. "Word is, he's been saying that Callahan stole something from him. That there's a debt that ain't been settled. And he's found people who settled debts for money." The kitchen was very quiet. Evelyn looked at the soup on the stove. She looked at her hands on the counter. She felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the December air. "He's hired men to come here," she said. It wasn't a question. "That's what the Ryder said," Cody confirmed. He looked miserable about being the one saying it. "Could be nothing. Could be talk. But the man who wrote in, he used to run with some of those outfits out of Billings. He said he recognized 2 of the names Barrett's been using. Said they're not talk." Callahan picked up his coffee again. He took a drink. He set it down. He looked at Evelyn. She was looking back at him. "This is because of me," she said. "This is because of Barrett," he said immediately. "Callahan Barrett made his choices," Callahan said. And his voice had the particular flatness of someone who has already moved past the question of blame and is focused entirely on what comes next. "He made them at that poker table, and he made them at the courthouse, and he's making them now. None of that is on you. Men could get hurt," she said. "Silas, Cody, you." The words cost her something to say. She could feel the cost of them, the specific weight of caring about people who could be damaged by association with you. She had not let herself care this much about anyone in a very long time, and this was precisely the reason why. "I could leave," she said. "If I'm not here, Barrett has no reason." Callahan's voice was not unkind, but it was absolute. "Just stop." She stopped. He looked at her with the steadiness that was simply, she now understood, who he was, the steadiness of someone who has been through enough hard things to know that panic doesn't improve any of them. "You leaving doesn't end this," he said. "Barrett's not angry about where you are. He's angry about losing. That's different. Moving you somewhere else doesn't fix his anger." "He could follow me. Or he could come here anyway," Callahan said. "Either way, the answer isn't you disappearing." Silas had come in sometime during this exchange, drawn, as he always was, by the particular silence of a conversation that required witnessing. He stood near the stove and listened, and said nothing until Callahan finished. Then he said, "I'll send word to the Aldridge boys. Tom and his brother both. They've got beef with some of the Billings outfits going back a few years. They'll want to know who's moving through the territory. Do that, Callahan said. I'll ride to Jensen's this morning, Cody said. Jensen ran the hardware store but was also, apparently, the person in Silver Creek who knew the most about who was moving between which towns, a function of his store being the first stop most travelers made. See what he's heard. They dispersed with the efficiency of people who have a working relationship with practical crisis, not theatrical about it, not pretending it away, just moving. Evelyn watched them go, and then looked at Callahan, who was still at the counter. You've done this before, she said. Handled something like this. Not exactly like this, he said. But trouble on a ranch is trouble on a ranch. You deal with it the same way you deal with anything. You don't let it make your decisions for you. I'm not letting it make my decisions, she said carefully. I'm asking you whether it changes anything. He looked at her. He seemed to understand what she was actually asking, which was the question under the question, whether she was something he would trade away for the convenience of peace. Whether Barrett's escalation would make him recalculate the math of her presence here. No, he said simply, it doesn't change anything. She breathed. But I need you to tell me something, he said. All right, do you want to be here? He asked it straight. No performance, no softening. Not whether you feel obligated to be here, not whether leaving seems like the responsible thing to do. Do you want to be here? She looked at him across the kitchen, this man, with his practical steadiness and his dead wife's seed catalog and his lock from Jensen's hardware, who had sat next to her in a courthouse and not spoken until she'd finished. Who talked about Margaret over coffee in a way that suggested he was, very slowly, learning to live in the same house as his own grief. She looked at him and thought about soup on a Tuesday afternoon and borrowed books, and the particular sound of Cody's unguarded laugh, coming in from the yard. Yes, she said. I want to be here. Something shifted in his face, the almost smile, and then past it, something more open than that. Then we deal with Barrett. He together. The next 10 days were tense, in the specific way that waiting is tense, not the dramatic tension of things happening, but the grinding tension of things about to happen, the awareness of a threat that hasn't yet taken a specific shape. Cody brought back information from Jensen's that confirmed the Billings men were real, and had been seen moving east. The Aldridge boys sent word that they'd heard the same names and were watching the main roads. Callahan quietly moved certain equipment to more accessible locations and had conversations with his nearest neighboring ranchers, the kind of conversations that didn't announce themselves as preparations, but left everyone in the relevant vicinity aware that the Callahan ranch was not a place that stood alone. Evelyn watched all of this and did not disappear into the small cabin and lock the bolt and wait for it to be over. She helped Callahan where she could. She kept the kitchen functioning as the operations center it had quietly become, men coming and going, information exchanged over coffee. Decisions made at the table where she served meals, and she stayed and listened, and occasionally said things that proved useful. She kept her fear in the same place she'd always kept it, present but not in charge. One night she couldn't sleep. She came out to the kitchen for water and found Callahan at the table, awake, a piece of paper in front of him, with notes she could see he'd been making about the property's approach roads. He looked up when she came in. Sit down, he said. I'll make coffee. It's 2 a.m, she said. I know what time it is, he said. He was already at the stove. She sat down. She looked at his notes, careful, methodical, the handwriting of someone who thinks in organized systems. You've been doing this for hours, she said. Couldn't sleep either, he said. You're worried. I'm prepared, he said. There's a difference. What's the difference? He set coffee in front of her and sat down across from her. Worry is when you let the bad thing live in your chest before it arrives, he said. Prepared is when you figure out what you can do about it, and then you do those things, and you stop carrying the rest. He looked at his notes. I've done what I can do. The rest I'll deal with when it gets here. She looked at him. You make it sound simple. Ain't simple, he said. Takes practice. He picked up his coffee. How do you do it? You're calmer than anyone I've ever seen in a situation that has legitimate reasons for panic. She thought about it. I learned a long time ago that if you show people your fear, they use it, she said. Not all people. But enough of them that it's worth learning not to show it. She paused. The fear's there. I just stopped letting it be the loudest thing. He was looking at her with that particular quality of attention that she had come to recognize as him actually listening, not waiting for his turn to speak, not half present, but fully there. What's the loudest thing? He asked. She met his eyes. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the snow that had been threatening all evening had started, soft and consistent, the kind that settled rather than fell. Right now, she said. Right now the loudest thing is that I'm sitting in this kitchen at 2 in the morning with a man who makes coffee when neither of us can sleep and talks to me like what I think matters. She said it plainly, without embellishment. That's louder than Barrett Holloway, by a significant amount. Callahan looked at her for a long moment. Then he set his coffee down and he reached across the table slowly, without suddenness, the way you'd move toward something you weren't sure of yet, and he put his hand over hers where it rested on the table. He didn't say anything. She turned her hand over under his and held it. They sat like that in the kitchen at 2 in the morning, while the snow came down outside, and the fire settled in the stove, and the coffee cooled in the cups, and neither of them spoke. Because there wasn't anything that needed to be said that wasn't already being said by the simple fact of two people who had both been alone for a long time deciding, without announcement or ceremony, to stop. The Billings men arrived on a Friday. There were 3 of them, which was 2 more than Callahan had been at his most pessimistic. They came up the main road in the early afternoon, not sneaking, which was either confidence or stupidity, and she thought probably both, and Callahan was already outside when they arrived, because he had people watching the road. Evelyn came to the door of the main house. She heard one of the men say Barrett's name. She heard him describe, in terms that were not subtle, the nature of the grievance Barrett had paid them to address. She watched Callahan stand in the yard and listen to all of it without moving. Then she walked outside. Callahan turned his head when he heard the door. His expression said, very clearly, that he had a specific opinion about her coming outside, and that he knew better than to voice it. She came to stand beside him, not beside. The 3 men looked at her. She looked back at them with the expression she had developed in the courthouse, the one that communicated she was entirely aware of the situation and had decided to be present in it regardless. I'm Evelyn Harper, she said. I assume Barrett told you about me. The man in the front, large, older, with the weathered patience of someone who had been doing this kind of work for many years, looked at her. Something shifted slightly in his expression. People who came to deliver threats generally expected to find someone who wanted to avoid them. She was not avoiding anything. He mentioned a woman, the man said. I imagine he did, Evelyn said. Did he mention that he lost a courthouse proceeding trying to claim I was his property, that a territorial judge reviewed his so-called contract and found it unenforceable? That the legal record in Silver Creek shows a formal ruling against him? She watched the man's face. Because that's the situation you've ridden into. You're here on behalf of a man who already lost, in court, in front of witnesses. The man looked at Callahan. That true? Every word, Callahan said. A silence. The other 2 men exchanged a glance behind the first man's back, the kind of glance that happens when people who have been hired for a job are reconsidering the terms. Barrett said the ruling was crooked, the first man said, but the conviction had gone out of it. Barrett says a lot of things, Evelyn said. He also said a work contract he put together over a card table gave him ownership of another person. That's the quality of his judgment. You've been paid to act on it. Another silence. Longer. The first man looked at her, then at Callahan, then at the house behind them where, she knew, Silas was standing just inside the door with a rifle he had cleaned that morning and hoped not to use. He looked at the road behind him, and she suspected he was also aware, without being able to see them, of the Aldridge boys who Callahan had positioned at the property line an hour ago. We ain't getting paid enough for a legal dispute, the man said finally. He said it to his companions, but loud enough that everyone present could hear it, which was, she recognized, his way of leaving with dignity intact. I reckon you're not, Callahan said. The man looked at Evelyn one more time. She saw something in his face, not respect exactly, but a kind of assessment, the recalibration of someone who had arrived expecting one thing and found something else. He touched the brim of his hat. She nodded. The three men turned their horses and rode back the way they came. Evelyn stood in the yard and watched them go. She was shaking, that was the honest truth of it. She was shaking from her hands all the way to the center of her chest. Because facing something down and not being afraid of it were, she had always known, not the same thing. She was afraid. She had been afraid the entire time. Callahan's hand found the small of her back. Not grabbing, not steering. Just there. Present. You're shaking, he said quietly. I know, she said. You didn't show it. I know that too. They stood there until the riders were out of sight. Then she turned around and walked back to the house. And he walked with her. And inside the door, Silas had already put the rifle away and was at the stove. And Cody was at the table looking like someone who had aged 2 years in an afternoon, and the kitchen was warm. Well, Silas said with enormous understatement, "That's done." "That's done," Evelyn agreed. She sat down at the table. Her hands were still trembling slightly, so she put them flat on the wood to still them. Callahan sat down beside her, not across, beside, close enough that his arm was against hers. Cody looked at them both and then looked at Silas. Silas looked at Cody with an expression that said, "Yes, I see it too." Neither of them said a word about it. "I'm making soup," Silas announced, and turned back to the stove. Evelyn looked at Callahan. He was looking at her. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" he said. "You handled it. You were next to me," she said. "That's where I intend to stay," he said, quiet, certain. No performance. She looked at her hands on the table, no longer shaking. She looked at the kitchen, Silas at the stove, Cody watching them both with young eyes, trying not to look like they were watching, the snow still coming down outside. She had come to this ranch with a bag that held everything she owned, and a promise she'd made to herself in a saloon, while men laughed. I will not let this be the end of my story. It wasn't the end. She understood now, with the certainty of someone who has tested a thing against real weight and found it holds, that it was nowhere near the end. It was in every way that mattered, just beginning. Barrett Holloway never came back, not in person. What came back, in the weeks after the three riders turned their horses and rode away from the Callahan ranch, was something smaller and more persistent than a man. It was his reputation. Finally catching up to him the way reputations do in frontier territories, where everyone eventually learns everything, and the only question is timing. Word came through Jensen's Hardware in January that Barrett had been seen in Miles City, working a game at a saloon there. Word came in February that he'd left Miles City under circumstances nobody was specific about, but everyone seemed to understand. After that, the word stopped coming, which Evelyn took to mean that Barrett had traveled far enough to become someone else's problem, and the territory was content to let him. She did not spend time thinking about where he'd gone. She had too many other things to think about. The garden was the first. She had spent the deep months of winter with the seed catalog and her notes and Callahan's observations about the light, planning it with the precision of someone who intended to get it right. When the ground began to soften in March, she was out in it. Silas watched her the first morning from the kitchen doorway, coffee in hand, the expression on his face, the one she had come to associate with him, deciding not to say something he was thinking. "Go ahead," she said, without looking up from the soil she was testing. "I didn't say anything," he said. "You were about to say I'm starting too early." A pause. "The ground's barely thawed." "The ground is exactly thawed enough for what I'm planting today," she said. "Which is different from what I'll be planting in 3 weeks. Which is different again from what goes in May." She sat back on her heels and looked up at him. "I have a plan, Silas." "You always have a plan," he said, but the way he said it had evolved considerably from the morning he'd handed her a spatula in a kitchen he'd been managing into inadequacy for years. Now it sounded like what it was, something close to pride, dressed up in the clothes of a man who would never say the word pride out loud if he could avoid it. Callahan appeared beside him in the doorway. She was aware of him without looking. She had developed, over the winter, A particular awareness of where Wyatt Callahan was in any given space, not anxious, not watchful in the old way, but the kind of awareness that comes from caring where someone is. It was different from anything she'd felt before. It was quieter and more constant and considerably harder to argue herself out of. "Soil's good on the east section," he said. "I turned it myself last week." She looked at the east section. He had done it without telling her he was going to, which was the particular way he did things, not announcing, just doing, leaving the evidence for her to find. She had found it 3 days ago and stood looking at the turned earth for a long moment before going back inside. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know it," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the garden with the particular expression she'd seen on his face only a handful of times, open in a way he usually wasn't, the wall down. Just a man looking at a piece of ground that had been empty for years and was about to become something again. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once and went back inside, and she went back to the soil, and Silas finished his coffee and disappeared, and the morning continued with the ordinary grace of things growing the way they were supposed to. The garden came in that spring with the enthusiasm of ground that has been well prepared and is finally being asked to do what it's for. The cold weather greens went first, then the beans and the squash, then the herbs that she arranged in the southeast section, where the light was best and where she could access them easily from the kitchen door. She put the medicinal herbs in their own dedicated bed: yarrow, echinacea, elderflower, valerian, lavender at the edges, and she labeled each one with small stakes that she lettered herself with careful block printing. Because Cody had taken to bringing her questions about the plants, and she wanted him to be able to identify them without asking. Cody had, somewhere between December and March, made a decision about his future that he hadn't announced, but that was evident in everything he did. He followed Evelyn through the herb beds, asking questions with the seriousness of someone taking notes in their head. He borrowed the book she had on medicinal plants, a worn thing she'd carried since she was 16. Given to her by the grandmother who had taught her everything in it, and returned it with a carefulness that suggested he'd treated it as the valuable object it was. He started keeping his own notes in a small journal he'd bought at Jensen's, recording what he learned. One afternoon in April, she found him trying to treat a deep cut on his hand himself, using the yarrow preparation she'd shown him, instead of coming to find her. "Let me see that," she said. He showed her, trying not to look like he was hoping for approval. She looked at his work. He'd cleaned it properly, applied the preparation correctly, bandaged it with reasonable technique. "You did this right," she said. He tried not to look pleased and failed entirely. "I figured I should be able to do it myself. Out on a ranch, you can't always wait for someone to come help." "That's exactly right," she said. She rewrapped the bandage slightly tighter. "Keep it clean for 3 days. Change the dressing tomorrow morning." "Yes, ma'am," he said, with the automatic respect he'd started giving her sometime around January, which still surprised her slightly each time. She thought about her grandmother, about a woman who had known every plant in a territory, and had spent her life passing that knowledge to anyone who would sit still long enough to receive it. Because knowledge kept to yourself died with you, and knowledge shared outlived you by generations. She looked at Cody's earnest, capable face and thought, there it goes. The spring also brought visitors. The first surprise was Mrs. Crane. She arrived one Thursday morning in April in her good coat with a jar of preserves that she set on the kitchen table with the brisk efficiency of someone completing a transaction. She sat down without being asked. She looked at Evelyn across the table with the expression of a woman who has spent several months revising a position and has arrived at the revision with some difficulty. "My niece has a fever," she said. "She's been 3 days with it. The doctor in Silver Creek is away until next week, and the fever isn't breaking the way it should." Evelyn looked at her. "How old is she?" 7. "What does the fever feel like, hot and dry or hot and damp?" Mrs. Crane blinked at the precision of the question. "Hot and dry. She's not sweating. How is she eating?" "Barely. Small amounts of broth. Is she drinking?" "We've been making her drink water. She fights it." Evelyn was already at the shelf where she kept her preparations. She selected 3 things, explained to Mrs. Crane what each was for, wrote down the preparation method and the amounts and the frequency. She added a 4th thing, a tea that would help the child sleep without fighting the fever, and wrapped everything together. Mrs. Crane received it. She looked at it in her hands. Then she looked at Evelyn. "I heard you speaking in the courthouse," she said. "I told Callahan afterward that you spoke well. I meant it." She paused. "I also want to say that some of the things I said to him before that, about your presence here being inappropriate, I was wrong." She said the last 2 words quickly, with the velocity of someone who has been working up to them for a while and wants to get through the delivery before the momentum fails. Evelyn looked at her steadily. "Your niece needs the elderflower preparation every 4 hours," she said. "Not more. If the fever goes above 104, send for me." Mrs. Crane looked at her, surprised maybe that she hadn't made more of the apology, hadn't required anything elaborate in return for it. "Thank you," Mrs. Crane said. She picked up her preserves jar to take it back. Evelyn stopped her with a hand on the table. "Leave it," Evelyn said. "Take care of your niece." Mrs. Crane left the jar. She left the kitchen with the particular walk of a woman who has done something harder than she expected and found herself still standing at the end of it. Silas appeared in the doorway the moment she was out of earshot. "Well," he said, "the child needs the preparation," Evelyn said. "That's all that matters." "That is absolutely not all that matters," Silas said with great feeling. "The woman came to you, after everything she said." He shook his head slowly. "You know what that means, don't you?" Evelyn picked up the work she'd been doing before Mrs. Crane arrived. "It means her niece has a fever," she said. "It means," Silas said, with the deliberateness of a man making a point he intends to land, "that this valley is starting to understand what you are." The child recovered. Mrs. Crane sent a note not to Callahan, to Evelyn, addressed in her careful handwriting to Miss Harper at the Callahan Ranch, which Evelyn read and placed in the seed catalog between pages she returned to often. After that, people came. Not in a flood, this was still frontier Montana, and people didn't surrender their self-sufficiency to anyone easily but steadily, with the particular rhythm of word spreading from one person to the next when something proves useful. A rancher's wife with a persistent cough. A child from the Henderson homestead with a rash that the mother had been managing unsuccessfully for 2 weeks. Old Walt Pruitt, who was the most stubborn man in the valley, and who showed up at the kitchen door one afternoon and stood there for 30 seconds, before admitting that his back had been bad for a month, and Silas had told him she might have something for it. She did. Walt Pruitt left with a set of instructions and the expression of a man who had expected to be dismissed and was not entirely sure how to process not having been. He came back 2 weeks later with a sack of potatoes from his root cellar and said they were for the kitchen, which everyone present understood to be a thank you delivered in the only vocabulary available to a man like Walt Pruitt. Callahan watched all of this with the particular expression she had come to love, quiet pride, the kind that doesn't announce itself but is entirely visible if you know where to look. He never said "I told you so," because he was not built for that. But sometimes, when she looked at him across the kitchen, while someone was at the table asking her something, she found him already looking at her, and the thing on his face was enough. The question came on a May evening. She hadn't expected it. That was the honest truth. She had been so thoroughly occupied with everything that was building, the garden and the visitors and Cody's education and the general daily work of the ranch, that she had stopped bracing herself for things. Which meant she had also stopped preparing herself for things she wanted. They were on the porch after supper. Silas and Cody had gone to the bunkhouse. The evening was warm in the particular way of early Montana summers, still carrying the last of the day's sun, the sky doing something extraordinary with colors in the west. Everything smelling of the garden and the turned earth and the particular sweetness of a season that has finally committed to itself. Callahan was sitting with his coffee and she was beside him, close, the way they'd been sitting beside each other for months now, without either of them having said out loud what that proximity meant. He was quiet for a long time. She had learned to let his silences run at their own pace, because what came out the other side of them was always worth waiting for. "I want to ask you something," he said. "All right," she said. "And I want you to know before I ask it that the answers doesn't change anything," he said. "About the ranch, about your room, about any of it. I want that understood first." She turned to look at him. He was looking at his coffee cup with the expression of a man choosing words the way you'd choose where to put your foot on uncertain ground carefully, one at a time. "Understood," she said. He looked up at her. "Evelyn Harper," he said, "will you marry me?" The porch was very quiet. She looked at him, this man who had torn a piece of paper in half in a saloon, because it was the right thing to do, who had a lock from Jensen's Hardware on a cabin door and a dead woman's seed catalog he'd carried for years and couldn't read, who made coffee at 2 in the morning and asked her what she was thinking, instead of telling her what to do, who had turned the east garden bed himself without announcing it and stood in the doorway and watched her work with an expression that was not complicated at all when you knew how to look at it. She thought about a woman who planted roses on unsuitable soil 2 years running because she'd decided they were worth trying. She thought about a promise made in a saloon to herself: "I will not let this be the end of my story." She thought about spring planting and borrowed books and 2 in the morning and the word home said at a courthouse door. And she thought about what Silas had said, "Same thing you are. Protecting the last piece of yourself you've got left," and she thought that maybe the bravest thing a person could do, after all the protecting, was choose to stop. "Yes," she said. He let out a breath. She heard it, the quiet exhale of a man who had been holding something and has released it, and she reached over and put her hand over his on the porch railing, and he turned his hand and held it. They sat in the warm evening and didn't say anything else for a while, because everything that needed saying had been said, and what remained was simply the fact of it, solid and real and theirs. They married in June. A small ceremony. Silas stood for Callahan. Cody stood for Evelyn because she had no one else, and Cody was exactly the person she would have chosen anyway. Mrs. Crane came with her niece, who was fully recovered, and who spent the ceremony staring at Evelyn's garden with the focused attention of a child who has decided to have strong opinions about plants. The Reverend from Silver Creek performed the ceremony on the porch of the main house, which Evelyn had chosen because the porch was where the question had been asked, and it seemed right to let the answer live in the same place. Callahan said his vows with the directness that characterized everything he did, looking at her, meaning every word, not performing for the small crowd, but speaking directly to her the way he always spoke, as though she were the only person in the room worth addressing. She said hers back the same way. Silas cried, which he did while maintaining an expression of complete neutrality that would have fooled no one. Cody did not cry, but he came close, and he compensated by eating an extraordinary amount of the food Evelyn had prepared in advance, which she considered a compliment of the highest order. The summer moved the way good summers do, with abundance and work, and the particular satisfaction of things growing the way you planned, and also in ways you didn't plan, which is the real reward of any garden. The medicinal herb section had established itself beyond what she'd hoped, and she began drying and preparing a genuine stock that she could draw from through the winter and offer to people who came. She started writing things down, the preparations, the amounts, the specific uses, in a journal that Callahan had bought her in Jensen's without being asked, leaving it on the kitchen table one morning beside her coffee. The journal filled slowly through the summer, then faster as fall approached, and she found herself with more to say than she'd expected. What she was writing, she understood midway through August, was not just a record of preparations. It was a record of her grandmother's knowledge, and her own additions to it, and the specific conditions of this particular valley, which plants grew where, which soils produced which potencies, what the altitude did to certain things, and what the cold did to others. It was a document that would be useful to someone after her, the way her grandmother's knowledge had been useful to her. She was writing it for Cody, who didn't know it yet. She planned to tell him in the fall. Barrett Holloway became a name that people in Silver Creek invoked less and less, and then rarely, and then only in the specific context of examples of what happens to men who mistake cruelty for power. Evelyn heard his name once, in September, from Walt Pruitt, who mentioned that someone had run into him in Colorado and that he was managing a dry goods store there, which seemed to her like an entirely appropriate final chapter for a man who had always been more interested in transactions than anything else. She did not feel anything particular about this. She had stopped feeling things about Barrett a long time ago. At some point, she couldn't precisely locate sometime between the courthouse and the kitchen at 2 in the morning, she supposed, when she had been too busy with the things that were worth feeling to maintain the things that weren't. The fall harvest was the best she could have hoped for, which was the result of the seed catalog and the margin notes, and Callahan's information about the light in the soil and the month she'd spent learning the specific personality of this specific piece of ground. She spent 3 full days in October, with Cody's help bringing everything in and processing it, and the root cellar that Silas had once called a root cellar was now something considerably more organized and complete, which Silas acknowledged by going down there and standing in the doorway for 30 seconds with his coffee and then coming back up and saying that he supposed things looked all right down there. This was from Silas, a standing ovation. On the last evening of October exactly 1 year, she realized with a start, from the night she had sat in a saloon and watched a man put her name on a piece of paper, she was in the kitchen, making the soup that had become. Through repetition and the particular alchemy of a place that welcomes it, the smell she associated with being home. Callahan came in from the barn. He washed his hands at the basin. He came to stand beside her at the stove, close, the way he stood now, not performing proximity, just naturally there, the way two people are, when they have stopped keeping careful track of the distance between them. "Smells good," he said. "It always smells good," she said. "It always does," he agreed. She stirred the soup. He stayed where he was, and she was aware of him the way she was always aware of him, the warmth of him, the particular quality of his quiet, the way a room felt different when he was in it, which she had noticed the first night in the kitchen and had never stopped noticing. "I was thinking about something," he said. "Tell me." "A year ago tonight," he said, "give or take." She looked at him. He was looking at the soup with an expression she recognized, as him arriving at something he'd been working toward for a while. "Yes," she said. "I sat down at that poker table because I needed to get out of the house," he said. "I don't usually play. I hadn't played in months. I sat down because the alternative was another evening in a house that was too quiet." He paused. "I used to think that was just bad luck, ending up at that table on that night with that hand." "And now," she said. He looked at her. "Now I think the word for it is different," he said. She held his gaze. What word? He thought about it for a moment, with the seriousness he brought to words, the carefulness of a man who didn't use them carelessly. "I think the word is grace," he said. "The kind that shows up in the wrong place at the right time and changes everything before you know it's happening." Evelyn looked at the man she had married in June on the porch of a house that had once been too quiet. She looked at him, and she thought about a year, about a locked door and a seed catalog and a kitchen at 2 in the morning, and a question asked on a porch in May, and a journal she was filling for a boy who was learning the names of every plant on the property. She thought about the woman who had sat in a saloon corner, with her hands folded in her lap, and made herself a promise. She had kept it. She reached up and touched his face simply, without ceremony, the way she touched things that belonged to her, and she said, "So do I." Outside, the Montana night was cold and full of stars, and the garden was put to bed for winter, and in the bunkhouse Silas was probably losing at cards to Cody with elaborate dignity, and in the kitchen of the Callahan ranch, which had once been the quietest house in the valley, two people stood at the stove and let the soup come to a simmer, and the warmth moved out from the center of that room into every corner, the way warmth does when it has finally found a place it intends to stay. The woman everyone once called worthless had become the heart of the home. The lonely rancher who won her in a poker game had not won a possession, he had found a partner, a purpose, and the truest version of a life he'd almost stopped believing was still possible. And the Callahan ranch stood in Silver Creek, Montana, solid and full and lit from within, Proof against every cruel opinion this world had ever offered about what a person was worth. Proof that worth was never something others could determine. Never something that could be written on a contract or decided at a card table or shouted across a courthouse room. Worth was what you carried inside you through every hard year, every cold room, every door that locked you out instead of in quiet and stubborn and absolutely certain of itself, waiting for the one person who would finally know how to see it. Evelyn Harper had always been worth everything. It had simply taken a man with enough sense to say so out loud.